Welcome to the Law Simplified. I'm Shavin Bandaranaike. Today, we have a very different kind of interview. We have a very different kind of perspective that we have for you today. We have Steve with us, who's going to show us and who we're going to talk to about the LSAT program, which most of you who are familiar with this channel is not quite used to, because we study the LLB, the Bachelor of Laws program, as well as any career tips in terms of the BPTC. So first and foremost, thank you very much for joining us, Steve.
Thanks so much for having me, Shavin. Pleasure to be here.
So just for the purpose of our audience, so that everyone's on board with what you teach, what you do, go for your elevator pitch, I suppose.
Sure. So my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been coaching the LSAT for over 10 years now. And for those who aren't aware, the LSAT is the law school admissions test, which is used for admission to law schools in the United States. I run the LSAT blog, which is an LSAT prep website. I've been doing it, again, for over 10 years, over 1,000 articles on every aspect of LSAT prep. And I also run the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast, where I provide advice to those studying for the LSAT and anything at all related to the law school admissions process as well.
That's fantastic. Wonderful. I think the very first thing that anyone who is an international student, which most of my audience is, if they are to select a jurisdiction such as the United States, for example, what would they have to know coming into the US trying to pursue a career in law?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So the American system, of course, is quite different from the Commonwealth system. Law is only a graduate level degree in the US. There is no undergraduate level law degree, so there's no equivalent to the LLB, meaning that you can major in any degree at all in undergraduate before studying law, literally anything. You can major in English, you can major in biology, you can major in mathematics, economics, doesn't matter. There are some people who will study something loosely related to law, but you don't even need to.
So does that mean that in terms of someone coming into the United States, does it have to be a US degree, or can it be a degree from any other country and then you can come in and start your LSATs or start your law degree?
That's a great question. And I don't actually know the entire answer to that, although I would expect that if you have an undergraduate degree elsewhere, that law schools in the US would respect that. They might have to do some calculations with your transcript to see the rigor of the courses and such. But I believe that your undergraduate degree elsewhere would still be sufficient. But of course, even if you have a law degree elsewhere, the law situation in the US is quite different. But law in the US kind of came into its own way. It's a separate system from the Commonwealth system. They don't look back to that same heritage. The Americans, they got their independence, they set up their own situation. So they're not looking back to the UK for guidance. They're looking only at US previous American cases from the Supreme Court and such, and other federal courts.
Okay, perfect. So in essence, let's say I'm an international student, I'm coming into the US, presume that I have a degree and it's sort of eligible for that, for any undergraduate degree which is required in the US. Now what?
So now what you'll have to do is you'll have your transcript from your undergraduate institution, wherever it was, and then the biggest thing is that you'll have to take the LSAT. You'll have to take the law school admission test, which is quite different from other countries, other exams, because I think, first of all, you may be able to speak to this too, standardized testing is a much bigger deal in the US than it is in other countries. Other countries, they have their essays, they have the letters of recommendation, and those are weighted a bit more heavily. Also the interviews, of course. In the US, things are much more numbers driven. And so your LSAT score and your GPA are the two biggest factors in the law school admissions process. Everything else will pale in comparison. And so the first thing you'll want to do is you want to study the LSAT quite a bit. And when I say quite a bit, not just even 2 to 3 months, maybe even 5 to 6 months. That's how important the LSAT is to the law school admission process in the US. And also consider that it is weighted most heavily in the law school admissions process. For those in your audience who may not be native English speakers or may not be that familiar with American English in particular, the LSAT can be a bit more difficult as a result because there are some differences in how words are used. And it's also using quite advanced vocabulary that's even difficult for native American English speakers.
Wow. Okay. So I think in terms of just to compare it maybe with a Commonwealth jurisdiction, with the UK or any other country, the LSATs could be compared to an entrance examination. Essentially, it's like a test to see if you are capable of following a law degree. Essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's the admissions test. It is a kind of entrance exam. And the funny thing about it is that, first of all, it's not pass fail. So you're ranked on a scale of 120 to 180. 120 is the lowest score you can get. 180 is the highest score you can get. And a 170 is the 97th percentile, meaning that it's quite difficult to get a top score on this exam. Even the top students are getting a 170, 171. It becomes very difficult at the higher ends of that scale. The other funny thing about the LSAT is that it doesn't test law. There's no law knowledge or content tested on this exam, which relates back to this idea that you could major in anything for your undergraduate degree before going to law school. So they're not testing your understanding of content. Rather, they're testing your ability to think critically, to think like a lawyer. And so what does that mean? It means being able to think critically, to think skeptically, to evaluate arguments, to hold several different pieces of a case in your head simultaneously and then make connections between them. And so it's something that most students really aren't familiar with when they're first getting into this. And for that reason, it often makes them feel quite foolish when they first see the exam and score poorly. But I tell them, that's okay. The LSAT is like a foreign language. And so, of course, you would do terribly when you first looked at it. You have to get a sense of it and get the rhythms and see the patterns. And over time, you'll improve.
That's a fantastic analogy as well that you mentioned, that the LSAT's like learning a foreign language. You'll need to sort of get the nuances right. So I'm presuming since you mentioned it's essentially a variance, right, between 120 and 180. So let's say a student were to go through one of your training programs and were to be coached by you as well, and was going to achieve 170 plus, as you've indicated in most of your videos as well. So if that was the case, what would be the advantage for the student thereafter? Like, why is that important?
Well, so if you got a 170 plus, even if you had a relatively low GPA, you would be competitive at the vast majority of law schools. And in the US, we have, we're big on rankings, we're big on numbers. And so there's these US News rankings of law schools that a lot of people look at, even though they really shouldn't, for a variety of reasons I can get into if you want. But these law school rankings, there's a group of schools called the top 14, and these involve the Ivy League schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton. No, not Princeton, actually, they don't have a law school, but Harvard, Yale, Columbia, NYU. These are some top schools, for example. And so these schools want top LSAT scores from you, because that is an indication that you'll perform well at their school. LSAT scores are actually strongly correlated with first-year law school grades. And so they're the kind of proof, or at least strong evidence, that you'll do well in law school. And law schools want people who will do well. They want people who will not flunk out after the first year, and they want people who will ultimately pass the bar examination and become licensed attorneys. And so it's a long journey, and it's a tough journey. And so they want to see that you have what it takes.
In that sense, the LSAT is not essentially a guarantee of entrance, but it's something that will show like a higher ranked university that you are capable of following their program, essentially. It's just another check. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not guaranteed.
So then in that context, fine. Let's say dream scenario, essentially. You've done quite well in your LSATs. It's sort of like recruitment scouting, right? The universities will look at whoever has gotten the highest scores. And then you have an opportunity at one of the big 14, the top 14 that you mentioned. So what's the process like? Like where does a student go from there?
Okay, so you've got your LSAT score, you've got your undergraduate GPA, you want to get your letters of recommendation, you want to ask your professors, you want to ask your employers, you want to ask anyone you've interned under. You typically want 2 to 3 letters of recommendation like this. You also have to write a personal statement of about 2 pages, double-spaced, typically listing your reasons for going to law school. Of course, you want it to be personal in nature, not simply a list of everything you've ever done that's on your resume. You want to focus on 1 or 2 big things and focus on those. You might also submit some sort of optional essays, maybe why you want to go to their law school in particular. You might also submit a diversity statement if you come from an underrepresented background or have something unique to offer there. And that's pretty much it, aside from your resume. So you submit all of that. Typically, admissions open in the fall around typically September. Law schools will open their applications for that cycle. Law school admissions is conducted on a rolling basis, meaning that they evaluate applications in the order in which they receive them, and there's not typically a hard deadline. Typically, they want you to submit them between September and February, but law schools now are actually becoming more open to receiving applications even as late as March, April, May, June, depending on their particular situation. As you said, it's kind of like a recruiting or scouting situation where everyone's kind of evaluating each other, and they're kind of waiting to see who else will come along. And so you really are competing against each other. as other applicants, and the schools are competing against each other to get the best applicants for themselves. And so they might actually waitlist or defer an applicant, even if you apply at the very, very beginning of the cycle in September. They may tell you, we're not going to decide now. We're not going to get back to you for maybe 5-6 months. And you're just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, but they're holding off to see who else might apply later. And so it's not really quite fair or polite of them to do this, but that's just how it is. It's very cutthroat in the US here. And so they might not get back to you for a while. Eventually they do. And if they do, let's say you have that dream scenario with 170 plus LSAT, 4.0 GPA, you're a really strong candidate. You apply to maybe a dozen schools, and maybe 3 of them come back to you and say, we will give you a discount on your tuition. We'll give you a scholarship money to go to our school. And as you may know, law school in the US is quite expensive. It could be maybe $50,000 a year and it's a 3-year degree. So that adds up to be quite a bit, especially when you're not working at the same time. And so they might tell you, if you're above the average applicant that they typically get, they'll give you money to recruit you to their school. And so they'll say, you got a great LSAT, we're going to give you $10,000 off your tuition, or maybe even we'll give you a full ride, meaning that we'll let you go to our school for free, which is an enormous benefit, of course. And so
yes,
I tell people, even just a single point or 2 more on the LSAT can get you thousands of dollars in scholarship money. And so there's a big reason to retake the LSAT if you might do better the next time.
That's fascinating. I think that's very insightful in the sense that there's a correlative result. I think there's a much more correlative result in terms of your scoring sort of leading to a financial benefit in terms of the US than perhaps even the UK. Because a bursary or a scholarship in the UK comparatively would be lesser when you consider how expensive, as you said, the law school process is in the US. You mentioned, I think very interestingly, you mentioned that it happens on a rolling basis and you're essentially competing with one another. So the universities hold off to see who better is going to come along, essentially. Yeah. What's the competition like, though, in terms of numbers? Like, how many applications do these universities essentially see? At least a ballpark figure.
That's a great question. It really depends on the size of the school. Like, some schools are small. Some schools might only have 100 matriculating students each year. Others might have 300 or 400. But they are receiving thousands of applications. And part of the reason for that is, of course, these applications are now all online. And it's because your application is mainly based on the numbers, you can use the same essays for all the schools pretty much. Some schools might ask, like, why our school in particular? And of course, you have to personalize that. And so you can't reuse that one. But there's really very little marginal cost to the applicant to apply to more and more schools. Like, it's not strange to apply to 10 or 12 law schools. The only thing it really costs you is the application fee, which is typically around $100. But a lot of schools will give a fee waiver, meaning that they'll let you apply for free. And I've always thought it's kind of funny that you have to pay them to apply to them because they're just taking your money and it helps them in a way because they're evaluated in part based on how many applications they get, how selective they are. And so they have reason to want as many applicants as possible because it helps them look better and be more selective.
Yeah. I think it's just like it's a gatekeeping process, right? It's a paywall essentially, just to make sure that not everyone comes into the picture. I think one other you've clarified a lot of details for my audience. I really appreciate that, Steve. One major thing I think I want to close off on in terms of like what an international student would want to know is essentially how long. What's this whole thing going to be? Where from the point of okay, I've sat for my LSATs to okay, I'm taking my oaths as a lawyer in the US. What's that time frame like?
Yeah, sure. So let's say you're taking the LSAT. It's offered all across the year, like 9-10 times a year now, actually. So you could take it, let's say in June. You could take it in June or July of this year. You could apply this fall in September, and then you get your result back, let's say in March of 2020. Then you can start law school in the fall of 2020. And then you're in law school for 3 years. After you finish law school, you then have to take a couple of exams. One of them is a professional responsibility exam. And then one is the bar exam. Once you take the bar exam, you are then a licensed attorney who is considered admitted to the bar, and you can then practice law. And so it's typically about a 3-year process once you begin law school. But then studying for the bar exam is like the next major exam you have to take after the LSAT. But the next kind of gatekeeper exam, but once you pass that, you're good. There's no pupillage process in the US the way there is in the Commonwealth system. And so you don't need to find a solicitor or anything like that to study under. You're kind of on your own after that to go find a job. And so you might find a job at a firm, you might find a job as a solo practitioner. It's really just kind of your path at that point.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but unlike many other sort of the Commonwealth countries, the US, the process might slightly differ based on the state you're in. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And so you have to be admitted to the bar in the particular state you want to practice in. And so you could be admitted to the practice law in New York, the state of New York, but you can't practice in California. Each of them might have their own exam. So it gets quite confusing because we have this federal system with 50 different states. It can get quite complicated. But the good news is that there is a multi-state bar exam that several dozen states are part of. And so you take that one multi-state bar exam, you're good for all of those states. So it does get a bit simpler in the end. And then, of course, there are commonalities between them as well.
I think that will be the most alien thing for many students coming in because, I mean, in a country like Sri Lanka, the UK, I think many other countries, you sit for one exam and then you're good to go wherever in that country. So here, I think you can't practice everywhere.
Right. The U.S., of course, likes to complicate things. We're still in the English system of measurement, after all. But the funny thing is that, at least aside from this multi-state bar exam I mentioned, there are a couple of big states in the US that are kind of like economic powerhouses where most of the action is happening. And so if you were admitted in a couple of those states, you would be pretty much good to go for whatever you needed. So for example, like I said, New York and California, those are two of the biggest. If you're admitted to one or both of those, that opens up massive employment opportunities. You wouldn't need to go through all 50 states because a lot of them don't have quite as much going on, based on where you want to settle as well, where you want to live.
I think that's a key factor that you mentioned, right? Because I think wherever you go in the world, the profession, the legal profession is quite a lucrative profession. So because of that, I think anyone would want to gravitate towards an economic center in a country. So that makes sense in terms of where you're going to sort of practice. But then that would essentially increase the competition that you're going to have as well, because everyone would want to flock to those states to practice, essentially.
That is quite true. And that's why you want to not only pass the bar exam, but also demonstrate that you've done well in law school too.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Before we wrap up though, I think it's good that since you've been very insightful, there'll be a lot from my audience crossing over to see their opportunities in the US jurisdiction as well. How can they get in touch with you in terms of your coaching and your preparation?
Sure. Thanks so much, Shaveen. So folks can reach me over at the LSAT blog. They can also follow me on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. It's at youtube.com/LSAT blog. And you can find the LSAT Unplugged podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and everywhere else.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much, Steve. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the insights that you've provided my audience. So until the next time that we meet, as always, have fun, stay safe, and obey the law.